to confiscate 10% of Palestinian land. If they wanted to build a wall on their border, the International Court said that's not a problem. What they said was, the International Court of Justice, when it condemned the wall, it said this wall is taking a sinuous path which is incorporating the Israeli settlements. That's what made the wall illegal. Now, Professor Troy says he would prefer if coverage of the Israel-Palestine conflict by Carter and others would assign responsibility to both sides. But the problem is, if you look at the international consensus for resolving the conflict, the burden of responsibility for the failure to resolve the conflict falls on the side of Israel and the United States. Carter is very clear in that, in my opinion, entirely accurate. He says the main problem is Israel refuses to recognize international law. The law is absolutely clear. It's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Israel acquired the West Bank and Gaza in the course of the 1967 war. The International Court of Justice said, under the UN Charter, Article 2, it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Israel has to withdraw to its internationally recognized June 67 borders. It refuses. That's the obstacle. A simple illustration. Every year, the United Nations General Assembly votes on a resolution entitled Peaceful Resolution of the Palestine Conflict. Every year, the vote is the same. The whole world on one side, the whole world on one side, and on the other side, the United States, Israel, and usually Palau, Nauru, Tuvalu, the Marshall Islands, and Micronesia. It's usually 6 dissenting votes. And that's it. The problem that I think is not that the world is, not that the coverage is biased. The problem is the reality is biased. I was reading a book today, to get to your last point you mentioned, by Ze'ev Maoz, a mainstream Israeli military historian, smart fellow, and it's a good book, and called Defending the Holy State. He says, in 100 years from now, people are going to be very perplexed by this conflict. He said, because he says, compared to other conflicts, this is not a particularly complicated one. And it really isn't. There has been a resolution, a settlement on the table for 30 years. And Israel and the United States have blocked it. That's the problem. And Carter, to his credit, forthrightly says it. One side is blocking the settlement.
I wanted to get back to Professor Troy. Israel has announced that it's going to now build new settlements in the West Bank. Do you think peace is possible with continued settlements there?
I think peace is possible with a recognition of the pain on both sides and with serious attempts at compromise. We historians like to say that what's your favorite text? Context. To claim, for example, that suicide bombings started in 2003 when they actually started by Hamas and others during the Oslo peace process. In the 1990s, there were suicide bombings in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem. It's a much more complicated story. When I look at all conflicts in history, it's so easy to caricature. It's so easy to say, oh, the Israelis are the bad guys, and to rely on the United Nations as an honest broker in this is highly problematic, given that it's the same United Nations that has been so biased against Israel, that had a big attempt to revitalize its ugly Zionism as racism slur from the 1970s in the early 2000 period. So I'd rather say this. Israel has tried, it's a complicated situation. Israel and the Palestinians are in many ways intertwined with each other. There's an intimacy between many Israelis and Palestinians that we don't see when we sit here in television studios and debate what's going on. And there's also obviously a lot of hatred. There's extremism on the Palestinian side. There's, as I said, a political culture which is highly problematic and truly vicious and ugly, where they kill each other as well as Jews and celebrate those deaths. So how do you break out of that? Israel has tried. Israel tried tried with the Oslo peace process, for all it's flawed. And that, by the way, to go to General Skrokov's point, in the 1990s, Bill Clinton was spending a lot of time. Yasser Arafat was supposedly the most welcomed foreign guest, the foreign guest who had the most visits to the Clinton White House. America put tremendous prestige on the line to try to get this so-called simple solution. And it fell apart. It fell apart because of failures on both sides. Let's acknowledge that, rather than saying one side is the bad guy, one side is the good guy. And to claim, and that, of course, during the 1990s was the period that al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden were issuing their fatwas, not so much about Jews and Palestinians and Zionists and Israel, but about American troops in Saudi Arabia, and about this broader desire to undo the great historical crime of Spain getting rid of the Muslims 500 years ago. I mean, there are much more complicated and bigger issues going on. And to reduce everything, as Jimmy Carter does, to reduce everything, as part of this conversation is doing, to this unidimensional perspective that if Israelis stopped building settlements, then, you know, somehow peace would reign in the land and peace would reign in the world, it's just not true. Israel tried, let's say, in Gaza in 2005 with its disengagement by pulling back. This was an opportunity for the Palestinians. This was a test for the Palestinians. I've been to Gaza and I've seen the beautiful beachfronts they have. And obviously there are a lot of problems in Gaza. There was no attempt at development. American Jewish philanthropists raised $14 million to buy out Israeli agricultural initiatives and pass it over to the Palestinians. Those farms were trashed. There were attempts, there have been attempts. Israelis don't trust. They don't trust because the United Nations gangs up on them. They don't trust because the International Court passes its decision on the fence wall barrier without talking about terrorism.
Professor Troy, we only have 2 minutes, and I wanted to ask each of you the issue of having this debate at all in this country. Professor Carter was invited to speak at President Carter was invited to speak at Brandeis University. Then the invitation was withdrawn unless he agreed to have a debate with Alan Dershowitz. Your book, Beyond Chutzpah, Professor Finkelstein, is also very much about what Dershowitz has to say about Israel, and his book, The Case for Peace. Your response on this issue?
I think that's an important question, maybe the most important, how to normalize debate in the United States about this topic. I don't mean that everybody has to agree with me. The question is, how do you open up a forum so people can exchange reviews on the topic? I'll quickly give you 3 examples, or a couple of examples.
We have 1 minute.
Yeah, take the example, a couple of weeks ago, Anderson Cooper's producer called me. So they want to do a segment on me having to do with the Middle East because he was in the Arab world. I said, don't waste your time. It's never going to get on the air. I know how it works. They said, no, we're sending down the camera crew. They sent down the camera crew, sent down the producer, interviewed me for 2.5 hours from 10 a.m. till 12:30. I said, it's never going to get on. I know. Well, she said, no, we invested the money. Long story short, it was killed. It was supposed to be on that night. Take the case of Carter. Okay, a serious debate. But why is it Brandeis University has half a dozen centers for the study of the Middle East, Arab-Israeli conflict, and so forth? Yehuda Reinhardt himself is a historian on Zionism. I've read his biography of Weizmann. Why is it, of all the qualified people they could have drawn on to debate Jimmy Carter, they bring a clown from Harvard? It's just not serious.
Professor Troy, 10 seconds on the issue of a debate.
Both sides feel that they're not being heard. That means that actually both sides are, to a certain extent, being heard.
We're going to have to leave it there, but I encourage people to email us at mail@democracynow.org to talk about your thoughts and what you would like to see pursued. That's mail@democracynow.org. Professor Finkelstein of DePaul University, his book is called Beyond Chutzpah. Professor Gil Troy of American History at McGill University in Montreal, thank you for joining us. His book is called Why I'm a Zionist, Israel Jewish.